Hi everyone, welcome to this week. We're going to be learning the perfect and perfect subjunctive in the passive. We're going to take a look at the active and some more general verb forms to review first, and then we'll introduce the new forms. All right, so just to sort of talk about principal parts for a moment, Latin verbs obviously have four principal parts, right? First, second, third, fourth. And you can kind of divide those principal parts in half based on what tenses you're dealing with. So that's what this line here is in the middle. So first and second kind of work together, and from first and second we get the present imperfect and the future in both the active and passive. And remember that the first principal part is really an outgrowth of the second principal part, meaning that the first principal part is formed, or the form comes from the second principal part, in that it is a similar form to the other forms of the present imperfect and future. When we're dealing with the perfect tenses, we then shift to the third and fourth principal parts. And so again, that big line kind of draws that divide between the present imperfect and future, first and second principal parts, and the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, third and fourth principal parts. But the third and fourth principal parts are further subdivided, and that's what this line here is, in terms of active and passive. So all active forms of the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect come from the third principal part. All passive forms come from the fourth principal part. So as we learn the passive subjunctive, the perfect, pluperfect, passive subjunctive today, we'll be dealing with the fourth principal part, because that is where forms for the perfect tenses come from. This is sort of a similar information, just sort of outlined a little bit differently, talks about tenses and principal parts, throws endings into the mix as well. I'm not going to go over that because it's a little redundant, but it is there if you want to review further. All right, so here's our perfect active. So if you remember, the perfect active comes from the third principal part, right, and the perfect stem. So the perfect stem is that third principal part, all of which will end in an I, plus a tense sign, which is eri, and then plus the ending. So there's your eri. You can see that repeated throughout. All right, and then your MST, mustis, und for endings. And remember, with the perfect active subjunctive, that the eri, the I in the eri doesn't change. So in the third person plural, where normally that int would change to unt, it stays int. All right. Part of that is because the perfect subjunctive is by far the least commonly used, and so they can afford to sort of use that form that they don't like the sound of. Shifting to the passive, and these are the new forms. All right. So like with all perfect passive forms, you're going to have the fourth principal part, and then you're going to have some form of the verb to be. And remember, it's this form of the verb to be that's going to give us mood and tense. And of course, it will also give us person and number, but that you're pretty familiar with. So in other words, the perfect passive indicative, we're not learning that now, we've already learned that. The perfect passive indicative is going to use an indicative form of the verb to be. The perfect passive subjunctive then will use a subjunctive form of the verb to be. And you can see here that what is used with the perfect passive subjunctive is in fact the present subjunctive of sum. So the perfect passive subjunctive is the fourth principal part plus the present subjunctive of sum. If that sounds familiar, it should be, or it should sound familiar, excuse me, because the perfect passive indicative is the same exact formation, except it uses the present indicative of sum rather than the present subjunctive. So nothing new to learn here, just things to put together in a slightly different way. The one thing I would remind you of or point out is that, remember, this fourth principal part is a participle. And as a participle, it needs to agree with a noun. In these compound forms, it will agree with the subject of the verb. So for your singular forms, you're going to have a singular ending, us, us, us. And for your plural forms, you're going to have a plural ending, e, e, e. And of course, those can work in the feminine and the neuter as well. And down here, you've got your other verbs kind of done out in their forms in the passive also. All right, shifting to the pluperfect, just to review the active again, similar to the perfect, you've got your perfect stem, right, third principal part minus the I, and then your tense sign, which is that isse, all right, plus your endings. Now remember that the pluperfect subjunctive uses that isse, which without endings is the perfect active infinitive. With endings, the perfect active infinitive serves as the stem for the pluperfect active subjunctive, and then you get your other verbs done out here. So shifting to the passive, a similar thing is going to apply to the pluperfect as it did for the perfect. So just as with the perfect, you use a present form of the verb to be. For the pluperfect, you use an imperfect form of the verb to be. And again, this is across all verb forms. So if you remember the pluperfect indicative, it uses an indicative form of the verb to be. For the subjunctive, then, you're going to use the subjunctive form of the verb to be, and both of them are going to be imperfect. So if you remember, the imperfect subjunctive is the present active infinitive plus the endings, and that's exactly what you have here for the imperfect of the verb to be. Asem, asses, asset, asemus, assetus, assent. And then your other verbs are done here. So same thing, no new forms, just kind of new ways to put them together. All right, now there aren't there aren't a lot of exercises that I have for these passives. They're not that commonly used. So we're going to modify this a little bit. So wherever it says form the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive the following verbs, all right, we are going to make the passive of these. All right, so you're going to make the passive, not the active, but the passive. So in other words, tremo, tremora, tremitus is the fourth principal part. So it's going to be tremitus, or if it's feminine, sit. And then the same thing, tremitus, or and esset. All right, if I skip down a couple, let's find a different one. Let's use vulnero, and no, let's use a plural actually. Let's use nego in number 11. So negati, or I, simus, negati, or I, essemus. Now, some of these verbs won't have passive form. So for instance, number 7, possum doesn't have passive form, so you can skip that one. So when you look up a verb and it doesn't have a fourth principal part, that's fine. You just don't have to do that one. All right, we're going to do the same thing here. All right. Sorry. We're going to do the same thing here. So you're going to identify the 4 pluperfect active subjunctive verbs in the excerpt. All right. Then what you're going to do is you're going to change those forms to the passive. So keep everything the same, but it's going to become passive rather than active. All right. So in other words, fuisent doesn't have a passive. So can't use that one. All right, quaesiset. So its fourth part is quaesitus. Spelled that wrong. Sorry about that. All right, quaesitus. And then it's going to be esset. All right, that's going to be its passive. So do that with the as well. All right, let's look at this week's summatives. So here you're just identifying the verbs by person, number, tense, and mood, all right, and make sure to include all possibilities. Now, these are going to be all tenses. So, for instance, miserent, all right, is going to be a somewhat less familiar tense than, say, dent or portar remus. All right, and for the writing, so you're going to make these, you're going to change these from indicative to subjunctive. All right, so whatever they are, right, keep the tense the same, keep everything the same, just shift them from indicative to subjunctive. All right, so in other words, vulneraweratus, wow, is pluperfect active. So I'm going to make that pluperfect active subjunctive. Vulneravisatus. All right, you're going to do those for the rest. All right, that should do it for me this week. Please be in touch if you have any questions, and I'll be here next week. Thanks.